Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions are available on archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago: the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a Democrats for Torture, CIA and Israel edition of News from Neptune. The Israeli Defense Forces prepare to kill more peaceful protesters in Gaza today. And Gina Haspel, Bloody Gina, is confirmed by the Senate. It has been said in the media this is despite her torture past, but Dr. No suggests that he's not convinced the Senate made that decision despite her torture past, but because of it. Our own senior senator, Senator Durbin, said that he might vote for Gina Haspel. But he didn't have to because the Democrats arranged it in such a way that enough Democrats voted to confirm her that the majority of the Democrats didn't have to do that. That is, the fix was in. It took 6 Democrats to drag Bloody Gina over the line: Nelson, Heitkamp, Donnelly, Shaheen, Manchin, and Warner. All of them are vulnerable in the polls this fall. Boot them out, writes Jeffrey Sinclair. Let's be clear, if those Democrats who voted for Haspel had voted against her, she would not have been confirmed, so writes Jeremy Scahill. 2 of the Senate's 51 Republicans, Arizona Senator Jeff Flake and Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, voted against Haspel. Arizona Senator John McCain was absent for medical reasons, but had said previously that Haspel should not be confirmed. The 6 Democrats who voted to confirm her were enough to arrange her confirmation, which is clearly what the Democratic Party did. Meanwhile, if it's 60 Palestinians dead in a day this week, what if it's 600 next week or 6,000 next month? Israel's bleak excuses and America's crude response raise this very question. If we can now accept a massacre on this scale, how far can our immune system go in the days and weeks and months to come? You're watching News from Neptune. David, I assume that horror is top of your list, or near the top of your list.
Yeah, it is, but just in response to one of your points, what is it that makes those senators vulnerable? Or what is it that they perceive that makes them vulnerable? And it seems to me that they are responding to that by voting for Gina Haspel in the sense that they want Republican votes.
I think you're right.
And so it isn't that they see themselves as vulnerable from the left,
right,
or they're so yeah.
I think that's true. The point is that we should see the vote for Haspel as a corporate or party vote, not an individual vote. We shouldn't say, "Oh, Durbin did the right thing. He said he wasn't going. He said he might vote for Haspel, but then he didn't. He's a good guy." This is nonsense because he was part of an arrangement with the Democrats to make sure that enough Democrats, for the reasons you suggest, would vote for, and others didn't have to. Often in cases, perhaps including the state of Illinois, where that would not tend to their support. So the important thing to see is what the Democrats as a party have done in approving the Haspel. They could have stopped her, but they chose not to.
So just to riff a little more on this before we get to the main serving here. Doug Henwood on his radio program yesterday and his editorial. Usually he just interviews a couple of people, but yesterday he had a brief editorial from himself regarding the Democratic primaries that transpired this past Tuesday and perhaps recently over the last couple of months, in terms of the Democratic primary candidates, especially for U.S. Congress, that have been endorsed by the Democratic Socialists, who have succeeded in, I presume, I haven't delved into all the details of all this, but I assume there's several or many Democratic candidates, basically of the Bernie Sanders ilk, who have succeeded to the finals and Henwood's take on this, which may be different than your take or my take, is that is a good thing because we need many strategies. We need to attack this on many fronts. And what Henwood was arguing is that, well, where has the Green Party gotten us? Where has the Trotskyite groupuscules gotten us? That it certainly shouldn't be seen as a bad thing, and not in a cynical way. I think he was implying that DSA supported candidates are moving forward, and that they should be supported, along with other tactics, including not only other parties but direct action of various kinds, or movement organizing of various kinds. Obviously, labor organizing would be at the top of this list.
I agree with that, and I think Henwood is right about that, about these various initiatives, which, as you say, we may evaluate variously in terms of their seriousness. I think the overall question, though, is a party question, given where the Democrats go as a party. And I think the Haspel vote shows that. In spite of their mavericks, in spite of their DSA members, in spite of these other things, the Democrats are down with the program. They're down with the program of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, more war and more inequality. And for that reason, I'm unwilling to give Democrats control of the House of Representatives, not because the Republicans are particularly attractive, they're very unattractive, but because the Democrats dine out on this notion that they are opposing the Republican policies when they're not. They're in fact supporting them, as the Haspel vote shows. In our specific case, the case of this district, the 13th Illinois Congressional District, from which we are recording this program, I cannot bring myself to vote for the Democrat nominee, who is a perfectly conventional, for the House of Representatives, who's a perfectly conventional organizational Democrat, backing all of those things that I just mentioned, against a Republican incumbent who's a perfectly conventional Republican incumbent. The difference is that by voting for the Democrat, we contribute to Democrat control of the House of Representatives, and I'm unwilling to do that, even though I obviously have no brief for what the Republicans are doing in control. The Democrats would be worse.
And rest assured, according to a little accounting or update that I think was on the Naked Capitalism website, that this district continues not to be listed as among those districts that anybody is giving serious thought to actually, in this case, Betsy Lonergan defeating Rodney Davis.
Right.
So you're sorry to say, Carl, your vote or non-vote or vote for Rodney Davis probably doesn't matter anyway.
My vote doesn't matter, David?
I don't think so.
What is this?
I'm promoting
Good
this
heavens.
idea. I'm promoting this idea that votes don't matter. I don't know.
I'm shocked. That's
just my being difficult. But anyway, sure, we should vote. Who obviously, under any circumstances, we should. There's tactical voting, and then there's principle voting, and there's all that stuff. We can be Catholic about this, as you like to say, small c Catholic. But in any event, so the ongoing events in Gaza, I observe the conservative responses, the quote-unquote liberal responses. I observed the media response, what I would consider the honest media responses that tell it like it is on the leftist websites. But of course, I reflect on where we've got, how we've come to this point, and I'm especially interested, as I always am, as to what the liberal responses are to this, and the past is prologue in that regard. It's very difficult for liberal columnists of the New York Times or liberal supporters of Israel in various guises to be unequivocally critical of what Israel is doing in Gaza, to place that in the historical context, which helps us to understand what it is that needs to be done. And it matters. Just like I was saying a few weeks ago, one of the liberal columnists of the New York Times, Roger Cohen, who wrote a decent column about it, but got the history wrong. And it's important that, because when you don't get the history right, you can't really understand what it is that needs to be done. In this case, all the talk is about Trump and the movement of the embassy. I think we need to talk about how that really relates to what's going on in Gaza, because I'm not clear. I could be wrong, but I'm not clear that the protests in Gaza are a response primarily to that, or even in a minor way to that. Yep. They are presented in our media like that. So, and I haven't done the work to see, well, exactly what are these protesters saying that they're protesting? Weren't these protests planned for a long time? Didn't the whole embassy business just turn out to sort of coincide with the May 15th Nakba Day or May 14th Nakba Day? I don't quite understand all that, but I think at bottom what I would want to say is that the Zionist project has been a settler colonialist project, just like the American project is a settler colonialist project. We've gone way beyond that to establish this global empire, but Israel is still in the process of settlement. Okay, and it's been in that process since obviously it's been in that process the whole time, but the current phase began in 1967 with the 1967 war. And the right wing, what is now being sort of distanced from, liberals distancing themselves from the right wing settlement project on the West Bank and the treatment of Gaza and the rise of the Likud party and people like Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu. What liberals are focusing on as if this is something new in the history of Israel and Zionism, and it's really not. The first major work that I know of that discussed the settlement movement was something called Zealots for Zion by a very good journalist named Robert Friedman. He published that book in 1992 based on research between 1967 and 92. That is the first 25 years, the first half of this 50-year period since the 67 war, in which the settlement movement began to securely establish itself in Israeli politics and in support in this country under a somewhat different guise. But that's the roots of it. In other words, it took root under when labor in Israel was still in power. So all of these things run together as a part of the Zionist project, and to not recognize it, the fundamental thing that needs to be recognized in order to understand what needs to be done in a more radical sense is that Israel is a settler colonialist project, and that needs to be stopped. And liberals don't want to see it that way, just like liberals in this country don't really, ultimately, whatever they think about slavery and the settlement and the genocide against the native people, they don't really want to account for that in their narrative of what needs to be done.
I think it's worthwhile to emphasize the ancient history to most of our contemporaries of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel in this regard. The 1967 war is, as David said, the turning point in the sense that the 1967 war destroyed secular Arab nationalism. The way the Middle East is presented to us generally by American media is mad Islamists versus democratic Israel. This is a lie in a lot of ways, and the lie, the form of the lie, was established by the defeat of secular Arab nationalism in 1967 by Israel, at which point, recognizing that Israel had done a job that the U.S. wanted done, the U.S. adopted Israel as a client, and that's the relationship that exists to this day. The state of Israel, the Israeli government, from 1967 on, actually promoted religious nationalism, including Hamas, the group they're blaming for the demonstrations in Gaza. Israel promoted these groups precisely because the religious nationalist groups, the Islamist groups of various forms, opposed the secular Arab nationalists that Israel properly identified as their opposition, their enemy. This is, as I say, an important aspect of the conflict that's got lost in the dark backward abysm of time. It should be remembered today when we hear these accounts of the conflict between democratic Israel and Islam in the Middle East.
Yeah. So, and what I'm getting at here, really what was as much of a primary point as I wanted to talk about, I mean, I'm not avoiding talking about all the horrible stuff that's going on and the massacres and how awful it is. That's a given on this program, that there's absolutely no justification and no excuse for what Israel is doing. And the shocking thing is that anybody on the page of the New York Times, and the worst excuse for that is Brett Stevens, just awful stuff that you wouldn't expect, to be writing about Nazi Germany or whatever in these kinds of terms. But what I wanted to get at is that Max Blumenthal did a nice interview segment along with a couple other people yesterday on the Real News Network, in which he focused on something. His background has a lot to do with working in Israel and exposing religious extremist groups there and settler extremist groups there. But his work before that had a lot to do with going into the sort of Christian right in this country and really understanding what the fundamentalists, the things we've been talking about for the last couple weeks on this program, and what he was talking about with Aaron Mate and a guy named Dan Cohen, who's in Israel, who he works with there, about what the influence and the relationship of the religious right, the fundamentalist Christian right, the evangelical Christian right, whatever you want to call it, John Hagee and this fellow Jeffers, who's been in the news the last few days because he was at he was one of the speakers at the embassy opening. And Blumenthal is, as always, well informed in tracing what the relationships are between the Zionists and these people, and going back at how the Christian Zionists were recruited into this movement during this last 25, 30 years. But the question, as it often comes down to with Israel and talks that we have about this, is it's another is the tail wagging the dog kind of question. How important fundamentally is this Christian? Obviously, it's important politically to Republicans now to support Israel in order to secure the Christian evangelical vote. But how important is it? That may or may not be. I don't know.
Oh, I think that's true.
To what extent, yes. But the question is how is it important to the ongoing U.S. foreign policy, and what Trump himself is doing, and again we run up against this. Well, is there something else going here besides the sort of overarching geopolitical relationship that the United States has with Israel, has had for the past 50 years, or is there something peculiar or idiosyncratic going on in the relationships between Donald Trump and Sheldon Adelson and Jared Kushner and Rabbi Shmuley and all these characters?
Yes.
So
yeah.
let me just put that on the table in terms of better understanding what's going on.
It is important to note, particularly in relation to what we've called on this program the higher anti-Semitism, that the Israel lobby in the United States is pressing for these horrific policies of the Israeli government supported by the United States, that lobby is made up primarily, probably, depending upon how you count it, of non-Jews. That a major part, as David says, of that lobby is American evangelical Christians, and that their presence at the embassy, Fufra, the other in Jerusalem, indicates their importance. As David says, it's also bound up with votes of all sorts in this country and a fair amount of money. So the importance of American Christians of a certain stripe to the Israel lobby should not be ignored. They're very important indeed. Our chief researcher reports that, in fact, looking at various accounts from Israel and the U.S. in the last week, his most shocking conclusion in some ways, beyond things we don't normally know, is that there is no real opposition in Israel to the massacre that's being carried out by the IDF. This is important, and this is indeed very dangerous. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz is actually a very worthwhile publication and publishes a variety of views, and there is clear condemnation by some of their writers of the Israeli massacres. It's by no means general, and it is a faint counterexample, not an important one, the exception perhaps that tests the rule, that Dr. Noah is quite right, that the internal opposition in Israel to crimes carried out these last weeks by the Israeli Defense Force, in quotes, is very weak. And that's unfortunate, but then again, that's also the case, I'm afraid, in this country.
And what concerns me about, well, first of all, one of those, Gideon Levy is one of those Haaretz columnists who has basically asserted for some time that there is literally, I mean, the opposition within Israel is so small that you have to get a magnifying glass to see it with, or to make any importance out of it. But again, my concern, and he was interviewed on the Real News Network also in the last couple of days. Again, not to repeat myself too much, but what I'm always concerned about, and what I have been concerned about in the 20 or 22 years that I've been studying this problem, and was at first I couldn't quite believe, 22 years ago, when I started finding out what Israel has done, where it has come, and how much support it had among liberal Jews and among leftist Jews. I know we keep mentioning Michael Walzer and Todd Gitlin and people like that, and how much it was supported by the new Republican Martin Peretz and all that. Okay, that's all water under the bridge. It's 20 years later, but still the question is, what are liberal Jews going to do about Israel? Are they going to just decry? Are they going to use the right wing, the rise of Donald Trump, the whole Christian right thing, to sort of absolve themselves? Well, now this isn't about liberal Jews having supported Zionism for the last 50 years. This is about Donald Trump, and that doesn't make me comfortable in that approach to the problem.
I agree with you, but it could be turned in one way that does indeed make sense. This is about Donald Trump, and if you substitute for Donald Trump the institutions of the American government, so this is about the institutions of American government. By this, I mean the massacre in Israel these last weeks. This is about the American government because Israel would not be able to get away with this if it were not for the political and diplomatic and indeed economic and military support that the U.S. gives to it. We heard darling Nikki, as Pepe Escobar calls her, Nikki Haley in the United Nations General Assembly, saying that what Israel is doing is what there's no country in this chamber that would do anything different. Yeah. She may be right, by the way, but the point was that she was defending thoroughly the massacre with the diplomatic cover of the United States. Without that diplomatic cover, Israel would find it far harder to carry on the crimes that it has been responsible for this last week and for a good long time before that.
Yeah. The foremost authority on Gaza, at least for the last 10 or 15 years, has been Norman Finkelstein. And of course, he's written a book that we've referred to on this program, and he's making the rounds. And given the sort of the timeliness of this, he's been interviewed by Amy Goodman and a few others, and not for a change about his views on the boycott movement and so forth, which he's not in the majority or not in the main quote unquote mainstream, but the points that he's been making based on his vast knowledge are very good. And one of the points he's making is that even in the human rights reports that he relies on, and international law, which he relies on, what the argument that he's been making is that they're judging what it is that Israel does, whether it was in Operation Cast Lead or the other massacres that have been perpetrated on Gaza, that the human rights reports and the international law judges those in terms of disproportionate use of force, indiscriminate use of force. And what Finkelstein has been arguing, which I hadn't heard him say before until the last week or two, is that these aren't even categories that can be talked about in relation to Gaza's relation to Israel. These are categories that we're talking about in wartime. These are categories that we're talking about in attacking other countries. Gaza isn't a country. The fence between Gaza and Israel proper isn't a border, officially speaking, and Israel has no right to be perpetrating any violence upon these people. And so don't even talk about international law in that way. So that I think puts it into sharp relief about what the moral equation is here. And there isn't anybody writing in the mainstream media or the New York Times that, which is the mainstream media, that even questions the fact that, there's a problem here. Is Israel using too much force? Is there a different way for them to go about it? Would there be a better way for them to do this without killing so many people? And these problems just aren't even being tackled, even by some people who are critical of Israel, like Michelle Goldberg and Roger Cohen. And by the way, did I mention, in case I forgot to mention it before, 7 of the 13 regular columnists in the New York Times are Jewish. Six men, and then Michelle Goldberg, the kind of token Jewish woman, but none of them. It's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable thing. I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, nobody talks about it. It's so obvious. But what does that mean? I'm not saying it would be necessarily better if there weren't so many Jews, or if there were more women. We know that doesn't work. But my gosh, how blatant can you be? And the idea there is that we have diversity among Jews. We have liberal Jews, conservative Jews, a right-wing Jew like Bret Stephens, who was brought in from Fox News, and it's like they can argue amongst each other as to whether Israel is doing a little bit wrong or nothing wrong, or blame it on the settlers and blame it on the Christian right and so forth. But again, never get to the fundamentals of what's really going on here.
It would be like,
so I'll rein myself in now.
It would be like saying in the antebellum South, did the slaveholders use disproportionate force to maintain the regime of slavery, or were they in fact not guilty of disproportionate force to maintain the regime of slavery?
Yeah.
So that's the level at which it's discussed by some of the people.
Hamas, but Hamas,
exactly.
but Hamas.
Right. with no real understanding either of what Hamas' position is, or, as I mentioned earlier, where Hamas comes from.
It came out in what some of the commenters in the New York Times article somehow came up with the idea, and I'm not sure where this comes from, that Hamas claimed that 50 of the 60 people that were killed were members of Hamas. I'm not sure if members or fighters. People just started. It's so typical of the Zionist propaganda that somebody gets hold of this and then they start saying it. What does it mean? Is it true? And what does it mean that it was Hamas, members of Hamas who were approaching the fence and got killed? I mean, it's just it's always something.
You are watching you're watching News from Neptune. This is a torture edition of News from Neptune, international and national, and we have, unfortunately, a large number of stories to tell under that heading. Here's one from our chief researcher. He writes of Julian Assange and his desperate need, and as Dr. No says, we can't afford to lose more truth tellers. Ecuador's denial of visitors to Julian Assange and denial of internet connection is basically torture. Denial of visitor, and I'm quoting here Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, who originally granted Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Unfortunately, Correa is no longer in office, and his successor, who was supposed to follow his policies and even has the iconic name Lenin, nevertheless does not follow those policies at all and is threatening now to turn Julian Assange over to the British government, which means turning him over to the American government, which has been after him for a long time. The President Secretary of State says he should be executed, that Julian Assange should be executed. Rafael Correa, the former president, talking about how his country's government is treating Assange, is the one who says that Ecuador's denial of visitors to Assange is basically torture. Denial of visitors, Correa said, is a clear violation of his rights. Once we give asylum to someone, we're responsible for his safety, for ensuring humane living conditions. But without communications to the outside world and visits from anyone, the government is basically attacking Julian's mental health and keeping him in a prison sharper than convicted convicts would be in this time. It's not the first time that we have heard that Assange's health is not good under the present conditions. A journalist and investigative reporter from Redacted Tonight that David referred to earlier is one of the few who's spoken of Assange's precarious mental state and ongoing pains for which he's not allowed to see a doctor or get the serious medical care he needs. This journalist joined with other prominent journalists to explain the situation and why he needs our support, and you can follow that once again on the Real News Network, one of the few places you can see this story, which is blacked out for the most part in their American media. Correa says that he believes that the government of Ecuador might be acting in a defensible way to limit Assange communications if he, Assange, were acting irresponsibly by referring in another country's politics, meddling in other politics. You've heard of that, have you? During the 2016 U.S. election, Correa said, his own government of Ecuador I'm not sure now as I read this which government he's referring to. Assange was told from governmental sources that it thought his attacks on Hillary Clinton were becoming excessive and briefly suspended his internet connection to underline its concern. That was the Ecuadorian government while Rafael Correa was still president. But that was just temporary, said Correa. We never intended to take away his internet for an extended period of time. That is going way too far, close quote. Korea's foreign affairs minister similarly said in an interview with The Guardian earlier this month that he too believed that the denial of visitors to Assange and the blocking of his internet access for this long, believed to be due to Assange's frequent tweeting over the Catalan independence movement in Spain. It was a favor, in other words, by the government of Ecuador to the government of Spain. This former foreign minister said this too was unjust. This problem of censorship, of disconnection from the net for Assange, is already itself highly questionable, but a new president in Ecuador brings a new policy. During his presidency, Korea was particularly assertive about the defending the sovereignty of his country from intrusions by more powerful states, particularly the U.S. In 2007, Korea ordered a U.S. military base in Ecuadorian soil closed unless the U.S. was willing to allow Ecuador the reciprocal right to establish a military base in Miami. And you know where that suggestion went, eh? But earlier this month, Korea's successor, Lenin Moreno mentioned a moment ago, announced that it had recently signed an agreement focused on security cooperation with the U.S., which implies sharing information, intelligence topics, and experiences in the fight against illegal drug trafficking and fighting transnational organized crime, close quote. Many in Ecuador viewed that as a prelude to the return of the days when the U.S. dominated Ecuador, including with new military bases, a suspicion Moreno's government denies. However, one point still evades a lot of people's assessment of Assange. Korea continues to believe that asylum for Assange is not only legally valid, but obligatory. Quote, "We don't agree with everything Assange has done or what he says," Korea said, "but we never wanted to impede the Swedish investigation." This was the crimes that originally got, the suggested crimes that originally got Assange seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Korea said, "We said all along that he, Assange, would go to Sweden immediately in exchange for a promise not to extradite him to the U.S., but they would never give that. And we know they could have questioned him in our embassy, but they refused for years to do that." Close quote. The fault for the investigation not proceeding lies, Korea insists, with the Swedish and British government. Korea is quite right here, and this fact is also what tells us that sexual misconduct allegations, they were never actually formal charges, against Assange were lies likely set up to get Assange extraordinarily rendered, in American speech, to a U.S. black site, the sort of thing Bloody Gina ran. The British and Swedish governments went along with that. So this is a shocking tale that has now gone on for years, and the clear reason is the U.S. Dismay at the revelations that have come from WikiLeaks, which has not been charged in their substance at all, but which are horrible reflections on the way in which the U.S. carries out war, including the Chelsea Manning stories of the war crimes committed by the U.S. in Iraq. This is what WikiLeaks has brought us, and this is the way the U.S. government, all administrations, have chosen to suppress it. A shocking tale of the suppression of free speech and of information about American crimes. You're watching News from Neptune. Comments, David?
I don't have anything incisive, believe it or not, to say about Julian Assange, except I was thinking about his relationship with Amy Goodman, his journalistic relationship with Amy Goodman, who at one time he was kind of a darling of hers when he was, first doing WikiLeaks. But there's been a lot of back and forth. I don't know what the status of that is now. I know that she's probably interviewed him in the last year or so, obviously from where he's trapped. But I have a feeling, my cynical understanding of it is he's sort of had to be let go by certain aspects of the so-called left or the liberal left. And that may have to do with many things. It might have something to do with the fact that Amy Goodman is extremely rightfully, but sometimes obsessively concerned with sort of gender feminist issues. And
I think that's right.
And that Assange got himself labeled in this way, however accurately or not, which again, as you say, has never been proven. So that's a little bit of a backstory, but it doesn't really have. The front story is that when the American empire wants to sort of liquidate people, that's what it does.
And the feminist connection is worthwhile. We have to remember that Hillary Clinton defended the war in Afghanistan on the grounds that we were fighting that war for women in Afghanistan, and if we withdrew, the lot of women in Afghanistan would be worse. Now, this is incredible nonsense, but the fact that it's comes up on the liberal left, if you like, frequently is not a surprise. Remember, during the invasion of Libya, Democracy Now! Put about the story that, well, of course, what's going on here is that the Libyan government is distributing famous little blue pills to their soldiers in order to make rape easier for the Libyan soldiers. That was Amy Goodman and the Democracy Now! When they had
she repeated that business.
And when she had a wonderful chance to talk about what was really going on in Libya and the way in which the U.S. was using illegally and untruthfully the UN resolution in order to attack a government that we wanted to overthrow, a government that we had, by the way, a denuclearization agreement with, which relates to some other stories that are going on right now, but that this sort of left liberal feminism, pro-war feminism that you talk about, David, is illustrated by that. And there are, unfortunately, other examples as well, including one this week. There was a push for the approval of known torturer Bloody Gina Haspel as new head of the CIA on the grounds that such endorsement is feminist, that it's time for it to break the glass ceiling at the CIA and let a woman become director, particularly a woman covered in blood. Her record alone should disqualify her, as our researcher says, and as a lot of people said, but the same sort of left liberal feminist nonsense was brought forward to say, well, it's good to have a woman as head of the CIA, even if she is a known torturer and a destroyer of evidence of CIA torture. You can't make this stuff up.
One footnote to that would be there was a country called Afghanistan back in the 1970s before anybody ever heard of it. I know when you said Afghanistan, when I was in college and people were traveling to Europe and stuff, sometimes somebody would get way out of the way and they would go to Afghanistan. I'm not sure how they even got there. There weren't any trains that went there. But anyway, there was an interesting article in Jacobin, on the Jacobin blog, which is free, which is open, and about the history of the communists in Afghanistan in the 1970s and the rights of women in Afghanistan in the 1970s, in that very poor sort of peasant country, but the emerging relationships with Western feminism and women's rights and so forth, and which of course led up to the takeover of the government, and then the overthrow of the government, and then the intervention of the Soviet Union, which at that point put Afghanistan on the map, so to speak, to American ears in 1979. But there is a prehistory to that, and it was a very interesting article. I'm sorry I didn't jot it down, but you can find it within the first 1 or 2 or 3 pages of the Jacobin blog.
The note that we have on the use of terrorism and the terrorism in the news and so forth is, I think, correctly commented on by a remark from Noam Chomsky, who says, and I quote, "There are plenty of people who live constantly under the threat of terrorism. If you want to find them, go to Yemen or North Waziristan in Pakistan, where people don't have to be told about terrorism. They are constantly in fear that 5 minutes from now, the guy across the street is going to be blown away, along with anyone else who happens to be around, by an American drone. And the numbers here are outrageous. In the Obama administration, perhaps 5,000 people were killed by Obama's drones in places like Yemen and North Waziristan. The Trump administration has followed up on that program and continues it to this day, and the fatalities mount. There's terrorism, very real terrorism that is not even discussed in the United States, or for that matter, for the most part, for the rest of the world, because the terrorism is perpetrated by the United States and occurs in countries that the United States, for various reasons, considers enemies. So if we want to get serious about stopping terrorism, that's a place to start.
I wanted just to return to Latin America for one moment, because there's an election coming up in Venezuela. Is it this weekend, perhaps?
I think it is.
Because they actually have their elections on Sunday. Who would have ever thought that you could vote on a Sunday? But and just to mention, as usual, I'm kind of venting about the New York Times. The headline on the New York Times about Maduro's primary opponent in this election, use the word dictator to describe Maduro, and it always floors me that they could be. I mean, they're blatant about a lot of things, but it's clear that Maduro isn't a dictator. But of course, they kind of explain in the text that they're implying they justify calling him a dictator by the fact that he's taken authoritarian measures as leader of the country. There's no doubt that Venezuela is in a real mess, and it's in a real mess partly because, or mostly because, they were too dependent on oil, on foreign currency, on keeping the price of oil high while Chavez was implementing his reforms from 1998 through when the bottom fell out of the price of oil around 2006 or 2008. But it needs to be said about the class struggle in that country. Of course, the ruling class, the ownership class, the opponents, what's referred to now as the opposition in Venezuela, has never made any effort to try to work with the government to solve these problems. Well, they want things to get worse and worse. And sure, that's what ruling classes do when they're not in power. But it needs to be said that they're part of the problem, obviously, and that who knows how problems could be solved or what course the country could take. They simply don't want the country to take the kind of populist course that Chavez tried to set out for it. They want it to fail. They want things to be thrown into chaos. And the New York Times, in a way that's vicious even for them, that is lying even for them, simply has it in for anything to do with the Bolivarian revolution, if that's what you want to call it. It hasn't turned out to be that way, but it's a pack of lies.
What's astonishing is how little we note, and by we I mean even people on the left in this country, how little we note that opposition is encouraged, stoked, financed, supported by the U.S. The U.S. is desperate to overthrow the government of Venezuela because it's not following orders, and it's rich. It has the major oil deposits in the Western Hemisphere. We've heard this story before elsewhere. The U.S. is working covertly to support the, quote, opposition, close quote, in Venezuela, precisely to overthrow the government the revolution that Chavez established. The comparison here is Ukraine, where the U.S. worked very hard. Oil was not so much involved, but the same politics were involved. The U.S. worked very hard to overthrow an elected president precisely because that elected president wasn't clearly going to follow American orders. They succeeded, and they produced the first government in Europe since the Second World War that had explicit Nazis as members. I mean, that's American policy. That's what we did in Ukraine. And when a couple of provinces in Ukraine, in the east, said that we don't intend to be ruled by this coup government that the Americans have established in Kiev, that government attacked them, and the U.S. supported them, and 10,000 people have died, apparently, in the revolt against the American imposed government in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. obviously wants the same sort of thing to go on in Venezuela, to produce a government that would be biddable to American interests, and then use that government to suppress the opposition that comes out of the Chavez-Maduro regimes or presidencies. The situation is very serious, and the reportage in this country is all about how there are food shortages in Venezuela. There are food shortages in places in Venezuela, and the U.S. is encouraging them actively, is doing what it can to make the situation worse and worse. A couple of parentheses here, or another aspect of this situation turns up in current oil politics. The U.S. In the Obama administration worked hard to suppress the price of oil, in part because the oil producers were not always following orders, and one major oil producer, Russia, was supposed to be hurt the worst by the drawing down of the price of oil. To a good extent, it worked, and it's bound up with other issues about American war provocations against Russia and the Iran deal as well. But what happened was that the oil price, after staying substantially beneath $60 a barrel, has now surged back above it and is moving up, and the international oil markets are predicting $100 a barrel oil prices. $100 a barrel as the price of oil would help the government of Venezuela because, as David says, it's a major oil producer. It would also help the government of Russia with its own economic problems and its resistance to American economic sanctions, and the developments are peculiar and interesting, and it's not clear that American wishes are being attended to here. The last Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who was an oil company executive before he became Secretary of State, was thought in part was put in position to regularize American oil relationships regarding oil with other countries around the world, and he's out. And the U.S. is apparently a bit at sea on this, particularly after the attempts to crush the Iranian economy seem not to be working quite so well. In fact, are having the interesting boomerang effect of dividing more, producing more of a wedge between the U.S. and Europe than anyone thought it would. So the jury's out, as they say, on oil, and that means the jury is out in some ways on American attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Yeah.
And it needs to be said, I guess I'll say it anyway, whether or not it needs to be said, that the so-called pink tide in Latin America has receded substantially in the last 10 years or so.
Not by accident.
And you would not by accident, but you would think that Venezuela was okay. The U.S. would be worried if there were still all these countries: Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, so forth, that were participating in this pink tide. But that's mitigated to a great extent. Venezuela is kind of what's left in this tattered material. And so this is really, there just isn't because of the nature of what the reforms were, because of the nature of global neoliberalism, because of the ongoing nature of American hegemony in Latin America, because of the vicious nature of the ruling classes in those countries that are allied with our own with our own government, it's just been very, very difficult to gain any traction in this sort of global and hemispheric neoliberal context.
We should remember that the only enemy that the U.S. government, and by the U.S. government I mean the institutions that represent the U.S. ruling class, as David was saying, the only enemy that the U.S. government really fears is the American people. That's the reason that the United States has developed over the last century the most sophisticated propaganda system that the world has ever seen. We call it mainstream media. But occasionally comes up with nuggets that are particularly, one almost wants to say amusing. Dr. No sends us one this week. He says CNN is telling people to trust the polls regarding the fall elections and the opinions of Americans, most importantly, what Americans really think about politics. Trust the polls, says CNN, quote, because they've been fairly accurate so far this election cycle, close quote. The polls that had Hillary Clinton becoming the next president by an over 90% likelihood, according to the New York Times. Those polls, yes, those are among the fairly accurate polls we're supposed to take seriously. Now, that's interesting because the point here is to convince people the poll shows something that the government institutions want people to believe, and they're 90% accurate in regard to such things as the election of President Clinton. You have been...
Can I just fit in one more thing here, just a reference at least to anybody, because there's been some Korea talk going on in the last few days regarding whether this meeting is going to go through, and whether this has all been a phony Trump thing. And it's been the liberal media, the New York Times, has been first to jump on the idea that this just isn't happening and Trump is screwed up again, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So if you want an antidote to that, and again I keep seemingly referring to Justin Raimondo's column at antiwar.com every week, because he seems to take on these things quite frontally. Maybe I've got a bit of confirmation bias working here, but at least if you want to know the other side of that and how he thinks the media has been finagling, how the war party has been with sort of finagling with the prospects, what he feels and what I feel are the genuine prospects for peace between North and South Korea, then you could look at his column this morning, Friday, at the antiwar.com website.
And the papers are full of the contrast between the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, and the President on denuclearization in North Korea. The neocons in the American government are desperate to torpedo this meeting between Trump and the leader of North Korea, and their way to do it this week was to say, well, of course, the leader of North Korea has to agree to denuclearization before the summit meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un can go ahead. Trump speaks to the media and says, "No, we don't. No, they don't. We're not going to have to. They're not going to have to do that at all," without saying that Bolton is off the reservation, which he clearly is. But he's on the reservation of those neocons who want to make sure that the neocon policies, the more war policy, continues in regard to North Korea, and that Trump's summit is destroyed one way or another. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. This has been a Democrats for Torture, CIA in Israel edition. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No J.B. Nicholson. The third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, next week we will be back with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.